I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, Times journalist Katie Rosman joins us. He'll discuss his acclaimed latest book, Red Scare. It's about some unsettling parallels between McCarthy-era paranoia and today's prevailing political turbulence. But first, let's get to our first guest, New York Times reporter Katie Rosman. Katie's been focusing on the escalating discord at Columbia University amidst the Trump administration's funding threats and student activist arrests. A tense intersection of academic freedom and political pressure have roiled the campus and may be reshaping higher education. Katie, you wrote that Columbia's concessions to the administration as it sought to restore funding is being widely viewed as a watershed in Washington's relationship with the nation's colleges. Why is that?
Well, I think for several reasons, and some of them are obvious. It's just the first time in decades and decades that the federal government has gotten involved in the policies of a private university. And the fact that Columbia conceded to many points indicates that the government's pressure worked. And there are a number of other universities that are concerned, and rightfully so, that they're going to be next on the list. So that's your watershed right there.
What did Columbia actually agree to do?
Well, so they agreed to a number of things. There was a list of demands that was sent to them on March 13th. They were given a week, and the letter that came from the Trump administration said that these items are not negotiable and that we expect these demands to be met in order for us to agree to negotiate with you to unfreeze or give back your $400 million in federal funding. So it wasn't even in order to get the money back. It was just in order to start a conversation to get the money back. So they agreed to a number of things that some people who work at the university say were already in motion. Whether that's true or not, we're not completely sure, but they agreed to an outdoor mask ban. They agreed to bring officers onto campus. They agreed to put an academic department and several other curriculums that relate to the Middle East under a new assistant provost.
What does that mean?
It's not totally clear, and I don't think that Columbia did a great job of communicating what exactly they were agreeing to specifically. Certainly they were under a lot of pressure and they had time pressure. So what was explained to me is that in departments across the university, there are courses taught related to the Middle East culture, the conflicts, plural, in the Middle East, and that there's no real uniformity. This was coming from a Columbia source, so let's be aware of where this person was coming from, and that they were going to bring somebody new in the provost office, which is an academic office, and have that person oversee a review of all the curriculum and to try to, make sense of where there's activism, where there should be academics, where there's activism that is appropriate, where there is perhaps messaging that could be anti-Semitic, perhaps where there's messaging that could be Islamophobic. They didn't state that explicitly, but one would hope that they'd also be on the lookout for that too. And presumably there would be some overhaul after that review, though I don't believe that was explicitly laid out. So those are among the things that are really getting a lot of attention.
Did the university push back at all, and should it have? And our universities, Columbia and Penn, are the two most public examples at the moment, but are institutions just capitulating to the administration, whether they should or not?
Well, so your first question of did Columbia push back at all? We don't really know because we don't know what we don't know.
Good answer.
Thank you. So my sense in speaking to some people who are relatively high-level people at Columbia is they were initially very surprised by the reaction to their letter. They were surprised that the press was seeing it as a capitulation. And I thought a lot about that over the weekend, trying to figure out, like, to me, it was very clear that that was how it was going to be seen, not just by the press, but by the public.
Certainly in terms of the timing.
Well, absolutely. And
they get a ransom note, in effect. And
respond to it. And I was, my sense is that maybe the reason they were surprised by the reaction is because they were going to go even further, and that they felt that they thread the needle in a way that somehow it was not the capitulation that could have potentially happened. Mm-hmm. But we only see what they've put forward, and it certainly seems like they have agreed to a lot of the Trump demands, whether or not they were things that the university already was considering implementing, which many of the things that were in the Trump letter were part of two task force. There was an anti-Semitism task force that did a very thorough review and report that it released last fall. And some of the recommendations from the anti-Semitism task force, which was made up of Columbia faculty, are things that were part of the Trump demand. So it's not clear. Maybe the university was considering enacting some of these things, but certainly the timing indicates that they did it, under the hammer from Trump.
Some professors at the law school said this is illegal, unconstitutional to withhold the federal funds. Is that so? Do we have any consensus on that?
Well, so I did a story about whether or not the letter was legal. The letter and other communications from the Trump administration kept on citing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the Trump administration also did not say that they were withholding the money because Title VI allowed them to. So it's not completely clear that this is applicable. But if, in fact, the money was being withheld because of Title VI violations, there's a process that is very clearly laid out in the statute, in the federal statute, that hasn't been followed at all. It's actually, you will not be surprised to know, a very lengthy process. And the statute is written so that the withholding of funds is an absolute last resort. And I understand from some legal historians that when the statute was being written in the mid-1960s, congressmen, and they probably mostly were men, the congressmen were very concerned about the statute being weaponized in a way that states could have their funds withheld. And so they really wanted to make sure that there were safeguards so that the withholding of funds was something that only came after a very, very long process that, according to legal scholars, has not taken place yet. So that's the federal law. Then there's a constitutional issue of intrusion into academic freedom, which plenty of First Amendment scholars, including Lee Bollinger, who I spoke to for that story, the former president of Columbia, who academically his life was spent studying the First Amendment as a law professor, that the Supreme Court has really made clear that they consider academic freedom built into First Amendment protections. And by that argument, then it could potentially be unconstitutional as well.
Katie, you pointed out in one article that withholding $400 million, that amount might not have been entirely coincidental.
So my colleague Matthew Haig and I reported a story about a business deal, a potential business deal between Columbia and the Trump organization in the year 2000, roughly 2000 to 2003, but the main action seemed to be in the year 2000, where Columbia was looking to expand. Coincidentally, there was the National Institutes of Health had doubled their budget, and universities were all clamoring to increase their research capacity through grants, but you need space for labs. And Columbia, of course, as we all know as New Yorkers, space is not something that comes easily or cheap. And so they were trying to figure out how to expand. Then real estate developer Donald Trump, this was pre The Apprentice, had a parcel of land that he had for years been struggling to make something happen with on Riverside Boulevard, far west side between 59th and 62nd Street. And so he proposed to Columbia a satellite campus that the marketer named Columbia Prime. And there were members of the Board of Trustees who were very interested in this, thought it was, I don't want to overstate and say that the deal was about to happen, but there were real negotiations going on. And Trump wanted the business school to be named the Donald J. Trump School of Business, and the price tag that he put on it at its highest level was $400 million. And Lee Bollinger essentially decided that he didn't want a satellite campus. He wanted to expand into Harlem, into Manhattanville, where the school has expanded. And so he put the kibosh on the deal, and Donald Trump was very angry about it, and for years later, railed against Columbia and Bollinger as being foolish for not taking him up on this deal. And the price tag was, coincidentally or not, $400 million.
We know he can carry a grudge. One last question. A lot of university presidents say universities should not get involved in political issues institutionally. Is that now becoming a trend?
Well, the University of Chicago famously said at some point many years ago that they weren't going to weigh in. Mm-hmm. They weren't going to make statements when following
apartheid and.
Well, you know more than I do then. So in any event, so after October 7th, there were a lot of schools that made statements that were seen as insufficient, not meeting the moment, somewhat mealy-mouthed in ways that upset people in the Jewish community and members of those university communities. And several schools have now said, we shouldn't be in the business of this, period. And I do think it is likely to become a trend.
Katie Rosman of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. Coming up next, Red Scare by Clay Risen. For my next guest, the chaos on our college campuses is right out of a political playbook. Joining me now, New York Times journalist, former opinion desk editor Clay Risen. His latest book, Red Scare, Blacklist, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. It explores how the Red Scare of the 1950s transformed American life and resonates today. The book reviews of this has said it's powerfully relevant. It said it is Hemingway-esque in its style. And Clay, you make a point of not necessarily drawing parallels between then and now. But Todd Wolfson, who's the president of the American Association of University Professors, looked at the, in effect, ransom note that the administration sent to Columbia and said the move was the greatest incursion on academic freedom and free speech since Joe McCarthy's crusade against communism. Would you agree with that comparison?
It's been quite an interesting couple of months because I can't say, barely a day has gone by when I don't wake up and think there is a news story that directly or sort of indirectly echoes some part of my book. For better or worse, it's you always want to have a relevant book, but this is a little on the nose. I think that there are a lot of parallels, of course, with the way that the administration has been treating university campuses. I think the idea that you could punish somebody for free speech, which is effectively what's going on here, I think has a direct echo to the Red Scare and the idea that the government has an abiding, unchecked interest in governing speech is straight out of the Red Scare. I think there are a lot of details that are different, but we shouldn't lose the forest for the trees.
Is it worse now or worse then?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. We're still very early in whatever story we're unpacking. And I think years from now, that'll be up to historians to decide. I think the doors are open to a lot of abuses that could potentially go much further than the Red Scare. That said, we know what happened during the Red Scare. We know that thousands of people lost their jobs. We know that tens of thousands, an untold number of people had their lives rearranged, and that a deep abiding fear defined American culture for a long time. You know, I don't think we're there yet today. I don't think we're anywhere close to it. But could we be very soon? I wouldn't say no.
You studied the Red Scare for years for this book. What did you learn about it?
Well, I think that was one of the things that I took home was that there are all the stories that we sort of commonly know about the Red Scare, whether it's the House Un-American Activities Committee and its hearings, Joe McCarthy, the Hollywood Blacklist, and I cover those in the book. But I also think that the impact on individual lives and the way that it got down into the culture, and whether it was in a classroom or in a PTA meeting or everyday union operations, these things were all warped by the Red Scare. And that, I think, was what interested me the most and what I hope comes through in the book.
And it's kind of amazing that half a century or more later, these things still resonate today, whether we're talking about historical events like the Hiss case, the Rosenberg case, or things that happened in the 1950s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that makes the Red Scare so important to study is that it touches on things that are fundamental to American life. I think the First Amendment is something that we often think about sort of like a fish does water. You know, it is all around us. It's something we don't pay attention to. But then moments like the Red Scare come along and you see a government deciding, well, we're going to sacrifice or we're going to impinge on the civil liberties of a select group of people or anybody we want. And then suddenly you realize that that thing that you took for granted is actually quite tenuous. And I think that's a lesson that we always have to keep in mind when we think about the Red Scare.
Good Night and Good Luck is playing on Broadway now. McCarthy did not create the situation of fear. He merely exploited it, according to Edward R. Murrow. How did it get created? Well,
to me, it really came out of two trends, I guess you'd say, or two threads. One was kind of a simmering conflict that grew out of the New Deal between a progressive vision for America and a more conservative one. And you saw this during the 1930s when the House Un-American Activities Committee was created or other sort of minor skirmishes. But it was not really front and center for a lot of people. And it was only after World War II that the onset of the Cold War brought this security mindset, this idea that everything is black and white. It's either safe or not safe. That the people who opposed that sort of more progressive culture were able to, take advantage of real concerns. I mean, legitimate concerns about espionage and about subversion, but minor concerns in the grand scheme of things, and exploit that and use it as a weapon against their enemies. And that's really, I think, the story of the Red Scare, is the use of fear as a weapon.
Was domestic communism ever really a threat here?
I don't think so. I think that you can look at individual cases, you can look at the way that the Communist Party at the leadership level was often a bad actor in the union movement, in some other sectors. It did work with Moscow to help during the 30s and early 40s to help facilitate espionage. That was not true by the time the Red Scare came along, but in part that was because the party was imploding. The Communist Party in the United States was never really a factor.
And what about in terms of foreign influence, in terms of espionage?
Well, yes, I think espionage was definitely something that we needed to be concerned with. And there is evidence that there were at one time hundreds of people working in the federal government who were feeding information either actively as spies or or spies as we think of them, or just sort of operatives, I guess you sort of call it. That threat, that activity was largely gone by the time the Red Scare set in, ironically. But we know from the Hiss trial, we know from the Rosenberg trial, these people did damage the U.S. government. So there was a real concern there. But again, it got taken out of context and out of control and used as a weapon.
And it wasn't just Republicans.
No, this was something that, obviously, conservative Democrats, Southern Democrats, who aligned often with Republicans, they were very happy.
And President Truman.
And President Truman, who, I think did not take the threat of a Red Scare seriously because he didn't take the threat of espionage and subversion seriously, or he thought it was a minor issue. So he created programs that in the context, in the moment, or in his mind, were supposed to be limited and not very effective. But in the moment, were sort of opened the door to all kinds of abuse, both within the federal government and then also used to legitimize things like the Blacklist and private sector red hunting. Because, hey, if the president is doing it, then there must be something to it.
In terms of a loyalty oath and
yeah,
things
exactly,
like that.
exactly. And at the state level, and oftentimes this went on long past the Red Scare. I know people who, in the 1960s, in order to get a license to be a hairdresser, they had to sign a loyalty oath.
Much less a teacher.
No, much less a teacher.
Was there any bulwark against the infringement on civil liberties then, something we need to be concerned about today?
Well, in theory, there was. Of course, there were checks and balances, all the usual, right? Checks and balances within the federal government, the courts and the legal system and the legal community. But these things did not stand up. Congress did not stand up to McCarthy, for example. They did not stand up to the House Un-American Activities Committee, by and large. And the courts largely went along with it. The legal community, aside from a few notable exceptions, and really only a couple of big firms and some civil liberties lawyers, most people didn't stand up. They would rather not be involved. And it was only toward the end, once Earl Warren took over the Supreme Court, and he's one of the heroes in the book because we know him for his civil liberties work and his decisions regarding school segregation, Miranda rights, but he was also absolutely integral in tearing down the architecture of the Red Scare through a series of decisions.
Who else was a hero?
Well, to me, Edward R. Murrow is a hero, and that's no surprise. Of course, he's in the focus of Good Night and Good Luck, but I think he was one of the few people who really got a bead on McCarthy and understood how to get under his skin and how to take him down. There are also a lot of people who are not famous, who are heroes for simply standing up to Congress, for refusing to name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Many people went to jail for that. Many people had their lives destroyed because of that. One person I focus on is a teacher right here in New York, Julius Salvati, who was the chair of the math department at Bronx Science. He was called before McCarthy's committee. They asked him, "Are you a communist?" He said, "No." Or, "Have you ever been a communist?" And he said, "That's my business. I'm not going to talk to you about my political beliefs and my past. I'm a loyal American." And when he got back to New York, he was fired for it, for not cooperating with Congress, and he was not allowed to teach. That's a small piece, but he stood up, and I think everybody who did that deserves credit. Eisenhower is an interesting case because he was obviously, no surprise, a huge anti-communist, but he was also disgusted by a lot of what he saw in the Red Scare. McCarthy, for sure, but also efforts to ban books. He gave a rousing speech at Dartmouth in 1953 where he stood up and said, this is un-American. But I think ultimately what Eisenhower did was he drew a line where he said, we should be very aggressive against communism where we think it might be. We need to protect the federal government as a security measure, but we also need to stop it with the red baiting and with the hysteria. And he very quietly worked to undermine McCarthy, and I think he deserves credit for that. He can always be criticized for not doing more or acting faster, and I think there's something to that. But ultimately, he was a very important factor in helping to cool off the Red Scare.
Clay, did truth matter? Now we have J.D. Vance talking about Haitians eating pets, and he said, when evidence was brought to show him it's actually not true, he said, well, the truth of it doesn't matter because sometimes we have to tell these stories in order to get a larger truth across. Did the truth matter then, and did people care about it then? Does it matter anymore at all?
No, I think back then truth did not matter. It was, as unfortunately Vance stated very clearly, there was the notion that the bedrock truth that someone like McCarthy was standing on, that there was communist subversion in the United States and we needed to do everything we could to stop it, justified telling all kinds of lies and bending the truth, and in fact not really caring about whether people were unjustly targeted or tarred or imprisoned. They were all simply collateral damage. And that's very dangerous, and I do hear echoes of that today.
How complicit was the press?
The press did not know how to handle the Red Scare. The press was, certainly parts of it were openly complicit. Conservative papers, the Chicago Tribune, for example, but even, let's say, center newspapers, unfortunately like our own, that were more in the traditional manner of sort of reporting the facts and not having any sort of critical eye on what was being said. And so someone like McCarthy, and there were many others like McCarthy, who saw that and understood that they could manipulate the press openly and that there would not be this skeptical eye on government activity. Remember, we're coming out of World War II when newspapers and reporters felt an obligation to be loyal to the government message. And it matters that then suddenly the message went off the rails and reporters went with it.
The book by Clay Rosman is Red Scare, Blacklist, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Clay, thank you for joining us. And that's it for this edition of Close Up for the New York Times and CUNY TV. I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.